now. So,
And
yes, Chris. Yes, Chris.
look, I'll have to get out. Jeannie wants to come in and she can't find the Zoom link, so I'll get out, give her the Zoom link and come back in.
Good. Thanks. Thanks.
I'll
Thanks,
be back
Chris.
soon.
And just a reminder to everybody that it was very helpful if you mute. We sometimes don't realise that we have other sounds that are coming in. So if you wouldn't mind muting your computers. As I introduce our guest speaker this afternoon, who has been to CCJP at least 3 times, and you would have all read from the flyer all the wonderful things that Leslie has been involved in, both here in Australia and internationally as well. And Leslie, I always think of you as one of these people that's been in for the longer haul that even some of us have been in this. So we're delighted you could join us this afternoon. Oh, there was one other acknowledgement that I wish to make this afternoon. Is one of our long-term members, John Butcher, brother to Mari. Mari, our sympathy to all of you. John was attended nearly every meeting over the last few years, plus every Zoom he could, until he became too ill to do so. So our sympathy to you and Jude, who's also a member of this community, Mari. But to Leslie, we just, look, we've been trying to look, Leslie, at all different ways of looking at this whole climate issue. We're in despair of what's happening from our government, and we're not feeling any better. Well, I'm certainly not, as people start talking about federal elections coming on. And when Leslie was in touch with Cecily, we assured Leslie that that all of those on screen are people who really do believe that climate change is a major issue of concern for us all. So, Leslie, you're very, very welcome, and it's wonderful to have you again. And I'll put Leslie on as the speaker so we can all see her better, and Leslie has a PowerPoint to share with us. Great to see you, Leslie. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Anne, and good afternoon, evening, everyone. I'm coming to you from the land of the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation here in Sydney, and I also pay my respects to their elders and communities. I've often said, Anne, that the CCJP are my favourite bunch of Catholics, so because you certainly believe in many of the causes that I've been working for. So it's a pleasure to be back with you and to be talking to you this evening, even though, as per usual, there will be some good news in my presentation, but most of it sort of won't be. I'll just warn you at the beginning. So I'm going to share my slides now. Can everybody see that?
Yes, that's fine, Leslie.
Okay. So I was asked this evening to talk about climate change and loss of species. So that is what I will try to do. Whoops, sorry. But I want to firstly emphasise the interconnectedness of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, because they're the twin crises. I mean, there are many more crises that the world faces, but these are the two really big ones that have such powerful impacts on how we live our lives. These two crises are, as I said, inextricably linked. You can't really talk about one anymore without talking about the other one as well. So I'll begin with a little bit about the other threats facing our species here in Australia. Then I want to update you on the latest climate science and what we know. And then I'll come back, circle back to the impacts on climate impacts on species and extinctions, and hopefully end with a little bit of good news at the end. So the problem is that climate change is not the only problem facing species here and globally. There's so many other things such as habitat loss and clearing, over-allocation of water resources, invasive species, etc., that Our species were already suffering even without the relatively newer impacts of climate change. And these two graphs that I'm going to show you are only very recently published, and they just show you what's been happening over time. So this is the number of threatened animal species over time in Australia, going from 2010, 2015 and 2020. And you can see it doesn't matter which group of species we're talking about, they're all being progressively more and more threatened. And in fact, the government announced just today a whole lot of new species being listed under the EPBC Act as at risk of extinction. And if we look at how many have gone extinct since European settlement, the bottom orange line is the number per year, and the red line is the cumulative number. And as you can see, that cumulative line just keeps going up and up and up. So that's the sort of the baseline that we're dealing with here. And the last State of the Environment report, which comes out every 5 years, so we'll be due for another one soon, lists a whole bunch of, it was pretty blunt, saying that the overall state of our environment is poor and continues to deteriorate. It then listed a whole lot of threatening processes, with climate change listed as number one now in that list. So that, I think, is significant. All right, so I'm just going to put the species issue aside now just for a little while I bring you up to date, hopefully as up to date as I can, with what's been happening to the climate. I'm going to show you a little animation. Some of you may have seen this before because I show it in all my talks because it is so powerful. This shows all of the countries in the world arranged alphabetically. You can see Australia there in the middle of the top row. It'll start at 1880 and it will run through to 2022. And when a year has a blue dot around a country, it means it's a cooler than average year. An orange or yellow or red dot means it's a warmer than average year, with the size of the dot indicating the difference from the average. It'll take, if you'll excuse the pun, it'll take a bit of time to warm up. But then from about the 1980s, things really start to happen. So let's get that going. So there we have it. So that shows the trend over time of how temperatures have changed all over the world, going from 1880, that's that first slide, to 2022, which is the most recent one included in that animation. And the message really is that things have been getting hotter everywhere. It doesn't really matter which country you're in, and it's all in the wrong direction. And this is the reason why, of course, humans have put 2 trillion tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere that didn't used to be there. And we're now about 50% more CO2 in the atmosphere compared to the pre-industrial period, which is higher than at any time in at least 2 million years, possibly longer than that. Now, you will have heard a lot of the more sceptical members of our community say, but the climate's always changed, CO2's always changed, this is just natural variability. So I'm going to show you why that is not the case. This graph goes back 800 years or so, 800,000 years rather, and shows that CO2 has been indeed bumping up and down over that period from about 180 parts per million to about 280 parts per million. That's natural variation. The problem is this bit. From the Industrial Revolution CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has not bumped back down to 180. It has kept going up and up and up, such that we are now completely outside that period of natural variation. So what is it doing to us? Well, to have a stable climate on Earth, things have to be in balance. We have to have a balance between the energy coming into the system and the energy going out of the system. And for about the last 10,000 years, during the time in which humans have evolved to the state and the level of sophistication and civilization that we have now, that was the case. But for the last 300 years or so, things have changed. We've still got the same amount of solar energy coming in, but because we've got more gases around the Earth that hold that heat close to the Earth's surface, we've got a lot less energy going out. So that, of course, has to create an imbalance. Now, a lot of the extra heat, more than 90% of it, is embodied in the oceans. Only 1% of it is in the atmosphere, with about 5% on land and 3% in the ice sheets. But overall, our climate is completely imbalanced now compared to what it was just a few hundred years ago. And that's what's caused this. Now, this animation unfortunately only goes up to 2022, but since 2022, things have really started, unfortunately, to accelerate. So 2023 has been called the year the climate broke, and Antonio Guterres, who's one of my heroes, who's the UN chief, called it the era of global boiling. He's got a certain way with words. I'll quote him again towards the end of the talk. One of my climate scientist colleagues was widely reported to have a different take on it. He called 2023 and the temperatures that were got to that year gobsmackingly bananas. Here's an example of that in Florida in July, so their summer 2023, the marine oceans across the off the coast of Florida got to 38 degrees, which is the temperature of the average hot tub. Unfortunately, that wasn't just a 2023 glitch. The trend has continued. Here's what's been happening in 2024 with temperatures continuing to rise. 2024 thus far was the hottest year on record globally. It was the second hottest year in Australia, but we did have our warmest spring. It was the first year ever in the records to be on average 1.5 degrees warmer than the historical record. June last year was the 12th consecutive month with temperatures over 1.5, and our sea temperatures around the country also hit a record. Unfortunately, again, those trends have continued this year, with January 2025 being the warmest January on record, with 18 months now in the past 19 where global temperatures have exceeded 1.5. Now, why do I keep mentioning 1.5? Well, it's sort of an important symbolic temperature because it's embodied in the Paris Climate Agreement, which remains our most significant international framework for climate action. The agreement aspires for the world to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, and if not, to at least stay well below 2 degrees. Unfortunately, it appears that now, based on the last couple of years, we may have permanently exceeded 1.5. Only time will tell, but that's what most climate scientists think has happened. Along with just the sort of gradual, though accelerating increases in things like global temperatures, what we're really worried about are things called tipping points. If this egg falls off this shelf, it breaks and it doesn't come back up. Here's a couple of examples of tipping points that we may be seeing already. So the amount of ice lost in Antarctica every year, for example, is on average now, in the last 20 years or so, 150 billion tonnes. The Antarctic sea ice extent, you can see the line there for 2023 and then for 2024, was very, very substantially below any previous year. The same thing has been happening in the Arctic. That dark black line is the 2024 average of sea ice so far, with the dotted red line just above it for 2023. So it certainly looks like we're getting to some sort of tipping point of polar ice melt. And of course, melting polar ice caps contribute to our sea level rise, which is accelerating with the rate doubling approximately in the period 2016 to 2018 compared to the average of the previous 40 years. Now, sea level rise goes up for two reasons. One is there's all that extra fresh water going into the seas from melting glaciers and ice caps. But the other reason is that because the oceans are absorbing so much of that extra heat in the Earth's system, and because warm water is less dense than cool water, there's just more sea level rise because of that volume impact. So what are we looking at in the future? Well, we're looking at more of the things that we've been getting used to in the last decade or so. So longer, hotter, drier droughts, more strengthened tropical cyclones, and I'll say something about Alfred in a moment, more severe bushfire seasons, and more heat waves. All going up. And of course, it's not really just the future because we're living the future. Climate change is not a future problem, it's a now problem. So here's a few examples from the last few years of how Australia and Australians and others around the world have suffered from this. So you might have seen these pictures before. Collaroy in the June 2016, a big storm out at sea, on top of that sea level rise, amplifying how much water was coming on land, and some pretty major infrastructure damage. This is an aerial view of the fires in California that we've just had in the last months, and just be reminded that these are fires occurring in their winter. It is not summer there, it is their winter, yet there was extraordinary fires. Most recently, just last month, unprecedented flooding in North Queensland. And of course, Brisbane is currently battening down, waiting for tropical cyclone Alfred to hit them, which will happen at some point in the next day or so. Alfred is the most southerly tropical cyclone since 1974. Cyclones get their energy from the temperature of the surface waters. So as that surface ocean waters increase, there's a much greater probability of that energy fueling tropical cyclones. And there is statistical information now to indicate that cyclones are not just intensifying everywhere in the world, but in Australia, they're moving further south. So in many ways, this tropical cyclone Alfred and where it is and what it's doing does not come as a surprise based on what we know about the science. So now coming back, so that's just a quick update on what's been happening to the climate. So we'll come back now to talking about what's been happening to biodiversity.
Well, what's wrong, brother?
And perhaps somebody...
Yes, I'm sorry, somebody needs to mute.
So I'm going to show you some sort of before and after pictures now of some Australian ecosystems to illustrate the enormous diversity of what climate change means for them. This is a picture of the World Heritage Area in January in 2016, where fires penetrated into these ancient forestscapes that had not been there for at least 1,000 years. These trees are over 1,000 years old and they're killed by fire. So we know they had never faced a fire in the previous 1,000 years. They take an enormous amount of time to recover. Our Black Summer bushfires, of course, we all remember, they burnt 18 million hectares of Australia, which is about 3 times the size of Tasmania. There were over 30 deaths directly, with about 400 people dying indirectly due to exacerbation of cardiac and respiratory disease. At least half the Australian population was affected in some way by smoke, probably most of the people on this call. Many homes lost, and really sadly, an estimated 3 billion vertebrate animals killed or displaced. That includes mammals, birds and reptiles, and an enormous insurance bill. Here's some other things that have been happening. Our coral reefs are bleaching all over the world. On the Great Barrier Reef, we've now had 7 bleaching events since 1998, 5 of which have occurred just in the last 9 or 10 years. The problem with them now occurring much more frequently is that the reefs don't have time to recover properly between bleaching events. So while some of the fast-growing corals are coming back, there's many of the slower-growing corals that are not. So the reef is losing diversity. And that is just a really tragic event. This is a picture from the Gulf of Carpentaria during an underwater heat wave, where over 10,000 hectares of coastal mangroves were killed as a combination of hot water, low tides, and an El Nino event. Our kelp forests all around Australia, which are really the forests of the sea, have been declining. This is a picture of the situation in Tasmania, where there's a sea urchin called the long-spine sea urchin, which usually just hangs around on the New South Wales coast, not really bothering anything much. It's been able to travel down to Tasmania and establish in the warming waters there. And normally it would be killed over the winter time when the water gets too cool, but because the water is warming, it's able to what we call overwinter and has exploded. Unfortunately, this sea urchin eats kelp and eats just about everything else, creating these barren areas and removing the habitat of more than 150 marine species. So this is, I think, a really interesting example of climate change advantaging a species which has gotten out of control, and that has had flow-on effects to lots and lots of other species. Over in Western Australia, these marine heat waves have also affected seagrass beds in a number of years, especially in 2011, but over this past summer as well. Seagrasses provide food and habitat to an enormous amount of marine life, not just fish, but turtles and dugongs and all sorts of other things. As sea levels rise, some salt water is now intruding further inland into what was formerly freshwater ecosystems. These pictures are from the top end, where we're seeing in places like the Mary River and the Alligator River, salt water coming up into these rivers, displacing these beautiful freshwater swamps, and leaving pretty devastated environments. And just the other day, I got this from the ABC website. Here's just an example of a particular species that's being endangered even more by the rising sea level. This is the hooded plover. It nests on beaches in pretty open areas. And as rising seas make their mark, more and more of the habitat of this already endangered species is being lost. Also over in Western Australia, we've seen with a combination of heat and drought, significant portions of the Jarrah forest there dying back. These eucalypts are really, really tough old beasts, but it just shows that there are some conditions which they just can't cope with. And here's, I want to talk about some impacts of heat waves on some terrestrial organisms. This is how we like to see our wildlife. We've got the flying fox here, spectacled flying fox, ringtail possums, Carnaby's black cockatoo. It's an endangered bird species. And of course, our beautiful koalas. That's how we like to see them. This is how we don't want to see them. Here's some examples of where extreme events have had really incredible impacts. So the flying foxes in the wheelbarrow there, about a third of the entire species up in North Queensland basically dropped dead in the space of a single day due to temperatures over 40 degrees, mostly the young ones and the lactating females. And it just brings home to me, at least as an ecologist, that usually we expect these trends to be kind of slow. This is an example of a single extreme event, a really, really hot day. Potentially, if that heat wave had gone for a couple more days, we could have lost the species altogether in the space of 3 days. Now, the possums in the top photo, these are ringtail possums, which is a common species. But these possums, and there were over 200 of them found on a beach down in the Mornington Peninsula, where the heat and the drought had absolutely got to them. It's thought that they were so desperate for water, they went down to the seashore and drank salt water, which of course killed them. The Carnaby's cockatoos in the back of that ute there, like the spectacled flying foxes, basically very, very vulnerable to hot temperatures. There was a couple of days over 42 degrees on the Western Australian coast around Geraldton, and a big proportion of the population also died. And then, of course, our koalas. We lost many, many koalas, thousands of koalas in the Black Summer bushfires, and many more ended up in wildlife hospitals like this one. Now, Australia, unfortunately, was home to the first mammalian extinction attributed to climate change. This was the Bramble-key Melomes. It's a little native rodent. It was really very rare and restricted to that little sandy atoll there. It doesn't look very hospitable under any circumstances. It was listed as critically endangered in the year 2000, and a recovery plan was written, which was frankly an absolutely pathetic recovery plan that said, oh, they might be in danger from sea level rise due to climate change, but not within the life of this plan. Well, the species went completely extinct the year after the plan was published. It is no more. It's the first mammalian extinction globally attributed to a climate impact. It's probably not the only one, it's just the one we've got the data for. So looking ahead then, how many species could we lose in the future? Well, this is a how long is a piece of string question. Many, many scientists have made estimates of this using different models and different assumptions. I was actually part of an authorship team that published a paper in Nature in 2004 that made the first of these estimates. All of these estimates are pretty rubbery because you can imagine how complex this sort of scientific knowledge actually is and how incomplete. But the latest estimate that was published last year, putting lots and lots of other papers together, was that between 14 and 32% of species in the world that we know about could be at risk of extinction in the next 50 years. It doesn't mean they'll all be extinct, but they'll be on a trajectory where they may be committed to that end. Here's some of those species that the IUCN considers most at risk. So Adelie penguins, because they need sea ice to forage on. Polar bears, of course, you hear a lot about. And the green turtle, which nests on beaches, which are vulnerable to loss due to rising sea levels. This, of course, is not just a moral tragedy that we should be upset about. It's also an economics one. And I mentioned this study because it's only just come out. In fact, I think it was published just last week. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics has just published a report, which is the first National Ecosystem Accounts report. So basically what they've tried to do rather bravely is to put a dollar value on some of the services that our ecosystems and species provide us. So the big ticket item is climate regulation through carbon storage, estimated to be worth over $43 billion per year. So they've used carbon prices, estimated how much carbon is stored in our forests and other vegetation, and done the maths. They've also estimated that our water, fresh water, is worth $34.5 billion, Our wild fisheries, 1.4 billion. Coastal protection from mangroves, 57 million. And there's a whole lot of other figures, but these are really the top line ones. So it's not just a matter of being upset about fluffy, cuddly koalas. This is actually an economics issue as well, because our whole economy and our lives rely on our life support system, which is our biodiversity. So that's just a quick, and I realise depressing snapshot of some of the many, many, many impacts. I could talk about this stuff for weeks, but won't. But I hope I've shown you that there's such a diversity of impacts on virtually every species on the planet and every ecosystem on the planet from climate change, combined with all the other things that they were already suffering from. So here in Australia, we're often told by some of the right-wing media and politicians that we're not particularly responsible for climate change because our emissions are less than 2% of the global average, about 1.5. Unfortunately, that's not the case because Australia is such a large fossil fuel exporter. Climate change doesn't respect jurisdictional country boundaries. It doesn't matter where the fossil fuels are burnt, they affect all of us. So we're the third largest single fossil fuel exporter. But if you rank us on an emissions basis, we're the second highest because the majority of our exports are coal, which is the biggest emitter. Unfortunately, our current government continues to approve or otherwise support new and extended fossil fuel developments since coming to office, despite doing some very good things that I'll talk about in a moment on renewable energy. It is cognitive dissonance, in my view, of the first order, doing really good things domestically, but still shipping off fossil fuels to be burnt elsewhere. That is our responsibility collectively. You can think of emissions in the atmosphere as a mountain that continues to grow. And what we have to do collectively, globally, is to get to the top of that mountain and to start coming down the other side. And the longer we wait to get to the peak, of course, the bigger the mountain becomes and the harder it gets. Now, I said there was a bit of good news at the end, so I'll share a little bit of this with you to stop you going and slashing wrists. The UK, for example, has just closed its last coal-fired power plant. The UK no longer uses coal for its energy source. Let's hope the rest of the world follows suit as soon as possible. And I think I found this graph the other day, and I think it is really, really illustrative. It's a graph of how long it takes over time to install a gigawatt, which is a lot, of solar power capacity. So in 2004, it took about a year to get a gigawatt added to the energy supply in the world. If you come down that line to 2023, by the time we got to 2023, so less than 20 years later, a gigawatt is installed every single day. I think that is a totally remarkable statistic, and it shows how rapidly the uptake of renewable energy is occurring around the world. So I think that's really good news. And here at home, a lot of people in Australia would be quite surprised to know that we already power the nation with 40% of renewable electricity. On some days, it's more than that. Some states are doing a lot better than others. Tassie's doing very well because they've got all their hydropower. South Australia is doing very well. And on some days, when the sun's shining strongly and the wind's whirring around those wind turbines, they get to 100% renewables. Other states, as you can see, are not doing quite so well. So there's still a lot of distance to go in the other states. But it's not that we're starting from scratch. We are well on the way. And I will give a shout out to the current federal government because they are doing as much as they possibly can, I believe, on the renewable energy side. So they're doing some good stuff and some not good stuff. So to finish up, here's my slogans, but they're more than slogans. I believe they're an absolute reality. We are in a climate emergency. Our physical and our biological world is transforming as we watch it. We don't have a lot of time to get to the top of that mountain and come down the other side if we are actually serious about staying below 2 degrees of warming. And we've seen how many impacts we've had with 1.5 degrees. That means that every fraction of a degree matters, because every fraction of a degree of warming is doing us and our world harm. That means that every year we delay absolutely matters, getting to the top of that emissions mountain. And it means that every choice matters. We've got climate change because of choices. We have all been part of those choices. We've made billions and billions of bad ones, and we need to make billions and billions of much better ones. So coming back to my hero, Antonio, he was riffing on a bit of modern culture here. He said, our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once. And I think that's a great way to finish up. Thank you very much, Anne. I'll stop sharing there and very happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Leslie. I must say at times I felt moments of despair during all of that. But I thought before we go into questions, I'm just suggesting that we each take a bit of time, just a couple of minutes to think, what was a surprising thing that I heard? And then what question do I have? We just take a little bit of time of quiet to think of that. What was a surprising thing for me? And do I have a question? So I invite anyone, if you could raise your hand if you have something that surprised you or a question you have. Mari, will you start us off? Thanks, Mari.
Okay. Anne Burners here with Marianne.
Yeah, I can see you, Anne. Good to see you.
I've always got something to say.
Good on you. You've got a question. It's your question, not Mari's question. Thanks, Anne.
I suppose my reaction was to the mangroves dying and jarrah forests dying. You know, can that sort of thing be turned around? It just seems devastating.
Look, it is devastating. Certainly those sorts of plants are probably more resilient to these sorts of impacts than, say, the World Heritage, Huon pines and things in Tasmania. But the issue is they need a break. You know, they need good conditions over several to many years in order to come back. You know, eucalypts respond very well to fire, they'll come back. But if you continually burn them, well, eventually they won't. Same with corals. Corals can recover and are very resilient to bleaching events, but they need years and years of non-bleaching to be able to recover back to their former glory. So the problem with climate change is that we're getting these repeated insults, I would call them, to these systems. Some species are more resilient than others. Some ecosystems are more resilient than others. They can all recover in time, but they need a break. And the problem is because climate trends seem to be accelerating, not just going up, but accelerating, the chances of them getting that break is becoming less and less. Oh, that's a depressing answer, I realise.
Thanks, Ed. Mari, did you have a follow-up? And then Helen, I'll come to you.
Just looking at what's happening with biodiversity in the ecosystem, I suppose one of the big concerns is our food.
Mm-hmm.
Like, as this continues, is any thought being given to, well, you know, if the animals in the ocean are dying and some of the ones we eat on, is there any way of looking at what's going to happen about food?
So there's a lot of research on this. And it's one of those situations where multiple threats are intersecting. So if we think about global fisheries, most global fisheries are overfished anyway. Some fish species are doing quite well out of warming. because they're ectothermic animals and they grow faster in warmer water, but some don't. We're seeing a lot of marine species move towards the poles. So the southern hemisphere moving south, the northern hemisphere moving north to stay within their preferred ocean temperature. So there's an awful lot of sort of literally churn in the oceans in terms of where things are. So we're getting lots of tropical species and subtropical species now, you know, coming down into Sydney Harbour, for example. That long-spine sea urchin going from New South Wales down to Tasmania is another example. So there's a lot of mobile change because marine species tend to be more mobile than terrestrial species. But yes, some fisheries are doing better out of warmer oceans. Many are doing worse, but it's all acting on top of most fisheries being overfished anyway. In terms of terrestrial food supply, and I could have given a whole other talk on food security and climate change. We're very worried about bees because bees pollinate an enormous percentage of our vegetables that we eat and other crops. And bees, of course, are once again threatened by all sorts of things, including climate, but also by pests and diseases, and those things are acting synergistically. We know that as the climate increases, our current varieties of things like wheat and rice and corn, which are the three major food crops feeding the world, actually their yield goes down over a certain temperature. Now, there's a lot of research going into selecting for yields that are more resilient to high temperatures and yields that are more resilient to lack of water availability, etc. So there's a huge scientific interest in this area. But food security is a real issue for the world. And it's especially an issue in places like sub-Saharan Africa and the subcontinent, which relies so heavily on regular monsoon rains once a year. And there have been many years now where the monsoon just hasn't happened. So yes, absolutely, food security is an issue with climate.
Thanks, Leslie. Helen.
Hang on, can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine, Helen.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, with renewable energies, are we making progress fast enough to keep up with demand, or do we need to supplement with nuclear? What's your opinion on nuclear?
Nuclear, and if you'll excuse the language, is a load of complete bollocks for Australia. So let me first talk about renewable energy. So it is the case that Australia is doing pretty well on renewable energy. The resource is there. The thing slowing us down is planning regulations in places like New South Wales, which are a bit of a barrier. Our community sentiment in some parts of the country has been anti-renewables, mostly kind of encouraged by some of the more right-wing elements in our society to reject. So that's an issue. There are supply chain issues, getting materials from places like China, and who knows what the US situation will mean for this. So there are a whole lot of barriers to even faster renewables rollout. But the federal government has a target of 82% renewables by 2030, which is a pretty ambitious target globally. It's probably one of the more ambitious ones in the world. And they are genuinely looking at, I mean, I think Chris Bowen's heart's in the right place on this, genuinely looking at ways of getting rid of those barriers to an increased rollout. Let me address the nuclear question because it's been so much in the news. So I'm a member of the Climate Change Authority, which is the independent body tasked with providing policy advice to government. We put out a report last Monday that estimated that by about 2050, under the opposition's policy of going slow on renewables, keeping coal going for longer and starting to roll out nuclear reactors, there'll be an additional 2 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere under that policy. So on an emissions then under the current trajectory of government policy. So on an emissions basis, nuclear is completely untenable. But the main reason it's untenable really is that we don't have an existing nuclear industry in Australia. We don't have the workforce, we don't have the expertise, we don't have the infrastructure. It's basically terra nullius as far as nuclear is concerned. It would have to start from scratch. It's enormously expensive and slow to build nuclear reactors. There's virtually no bank in the world that would lend money, so it would have to be taxpayer funded. There are the communities in the places where there are currently coal-fired power stations that the opposition has said would be where the nuclear power stations would go, are very opposed for all sorts of reasons. There's the toxic waste to get rid of. We can't even properly dispose of the toxic waste that we have from medical purposes now, let alone nuclear reactors. It would mean it's far more expensive for households than renewables, which is now the cheapest form of energy production. So there's absolutely no argument that actually stacks up. It needs a lot of water as well for cooling reactors. It's a utterly stupid policy, and it was put into place purely as a wedge for the government and to keep the backbench of the opposition in line. So I personally don't think that Peter Dutton has any intention of building a nuclear reactor anytime soon, even if he gets in. It's a ridiculous distraction from what we need to do.
That's very clear. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? I mean, I'm sure there are others. Cecily.
Oh, Leslie, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I was shocked by the percentage of heat in the ocean. I didn't realise how much had been absorbed by the ocean.
And it's just as well for us on land that that's happening.
Absolutely.
But eventually, what I didn't say was that it'll all equilibrate. So because of that imbalance, that heat will come out at some point and even itself out over the globe. And then that's when things get tricky.
My second point is, it seems to me that our progress depends on changes of government can halt or carry on our progress. There doesn't seem to be any way to set a target of action and stick with it, regardless of what side of politics is in power.
Well, look, I agree that the government of the day has enormous sway over how rapidly things roll out. It is the case that the coalition has said they would stick with the Paris targets. Under the Paris Agreement, we have to provide new targets for 2035 this year before the next COP meeting. They should have been in by February, but 170 odd countries around the world have delayed, a lot because of the US election and seeing what the lie of the land will be. We have delayed that as well in Australia. So the Climate Change Authority is tasked with providing the government with advice on that. And I'm hoping that that advice will be out in about May. So it'll be after the election. The opposition has said they would stick to Paris. They will stick with the net zero by 2050 target. Net zero by 2050, by the way, is actually too late to really avoid going over 2 degrees. It's probably more like 2.6 degrees. So, yeah, it is the case that there are governments better on this sort of stuff and governments that are worse on this sort of stuff. But I think because money drives a lot, and now that renewables really are much cheaper than any other form of energy, and the fact that our coal-fired power stations are all over 40 years old, some considerably older than that, and they are breaking down all the time, we can't keep them going. Even if the opposition gets in, they'll be under a lot of pressure to maintain the renewables rollout. At least I hope that's the case. Obviously, I would like to see personally a hung parliament with the balance of power held by the progressive independents. So we'll see what happens.
Thanks, Leslie.
Evelyn.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Leslie, for a very inspiring talk. I was taken by the fact that the UK has weaned itself from the use of fossil fuels. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the process that they had to go through to get to that stage, and what is the mix of renewables that sustain them in this day?
Well, the UK, one of the reasons, and it might seem at odds with what I said before about nuclear, they still have nuclear power. But they've had nuclear power for a very long time, so they've already got the infrastructure, unlike Australia, and they've ramped that up. They've also ramped up their renewables, especially offshore wind. Like the North Sea is just covered in wind turbines. So they've been able to do that. And I think they just face the situation as we do of aging coal-fired power stations. They don't have a coal mining industry anymore. It just made sense economically as well as from a climate perspective to shut those coal-fired power stations down. And, it was Labor Party policy coming into the election to do that. And so they've followed through on that policy. But I think the Conservatives would have probably had to do it fairly soon anyway. So they're in a very different position in terms of their energy mix to us. They've got the offshore wind infrastructure already bedded down and have had it for a long time, and they've had nuclear power for a long time. Our situation is very different to that.
Thank you, Leslie. I suppose it caught my attention because I tend to point to the UK as the source of all this trouble, where the Industrial Revolution began.
Yes.
Now they're being quoted as one country that can deal with it in some way.
Yes.
So thanks.
So look, I mean, we mustn't sort of pretend that the Industrial Revolution was all bad. I mean, we enjoy the standard of living we have today because of that. Nobody realised at the time, I think, coal-fired power was a miracle. It was only much later than that we realised that there was a real downside, and the problem is we haven't moved fast enough to deal with that downside.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I'd be really interested to know other surprises, because sometimes the surprises surprise me.
Well, I'll come in with a surprise.
Okay.
The surprise to me was the birds.
Yeah.
Right early on in your slides, the species of birds who have gone extinct was higher than any other. Than any other grouping. And it probably, I'm going to throw a question in then that's part of that, is that's often used as an excuse for not increasing our offshore wind power. Because of what is happening to birds and to sea life. And to me, that sounds stupid, but am I being stupid when...
No, I don't think you're being stupid at all. I think impacts on marine life has been used by anti-wind campaigners. There's really no scientific evidence that offshore wind turbines have any negative effect on marine life. And it's been studied and studied and studied. Whales in particular have been studied in this respect. Whales are pretty smart. They just swim around them. The other thing about offshore wind turbines is that in the Northern Hemisphere, where there's a lot more of them, they actually result in local increases in diversity, because boats and fishing are often prevented from getting too close. They become little marine reserves. And so lots of things colonise the pylons. There's lots of fish that can breed there unmolested from fishing. And they can actually be quite a positive thing in the environment, because the one thing that's missing from much of our marine environment are places for species to hide out and settle. So if you put something in for them to settle around or to shelter with, they'll often increase local diversity. So I think the impact that purported impact of offshore wind on species is just being used disingenuously as a campaigning tool by people that just for some reason don't want renewables.
Mark, you had a question. Mark Hinchy and then Mark
Yeah.
Shepherd.
Thanks, Leslie, again. Wonderful. My surprise, I think, was when you gave us the statistics on how these species service us in economic terms. I thought that was quite extraordinary and could be surely a selling point when we're so convinced and so concerned about inflation or budget problems and the bottom line and so on, to think that it's going to help our economy. And my question, though, was perhaps connected, but in terms of the environmental impact study law that we're hoping you'll get some change on, could you speak a little bit about what that is and how we can go about putting some pressure or protection for these species that we want to do?
Thanks, Margaret. It's a really good question. It's a really difficult one to answer. The EPBC Act, which is our main federal Environmental Protection Act, has been in place for a long time. It's been reviewed many times, and the last review, which was the Samuels Review, did a pretty thorough hatchet job on it, pointing out all of the things that are wrong with it and also pointing a way forward of how to make it actually do the job that it's supposed to do. And the fact is that all the while that we've had that act, our ecosystems and species have continued to decline. So clearly it's failing. And I think everybody even on the right side of politics acknowledge it's failing. Our problem with it is that it's seen by elements of the political spectrum, including elements within Labor, as being a brake on development and a brake, especially on resource extraction, but other development as well. And business doesn't like anything to get in the way of making a profit. So that's where the tension relies. You know, to work, it actually has to be a brake on development, at least some sorts of development, because it's those developments, as well as agriculture, that have got us into the pickle that we're in now. But there are elements that are very powerful, especially in the resources sector and especially in Western Australia, that do not want a law that could potentially slow them down. Whereas those of us in the conservation world want things to slow them down. So, you know, it's absolutely a black and white battle in many ways there. So as we saw, the government was under Tanya Plibersek's leadership was inching towards at least fixing up some of the act. And then Albanese sort of turned around and killed it after a single phone call from the Western Australian Premier that said, well, we don't want anything getting in the way of us extracting everything out of the state making money. And he bowed to that, just as he has bowed to the salmon industry in Macquarie Harbour, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, it's the case of where Labor's a lot better on a lot of these environmental things than the coalition. They're certainly not good. They'd still get an F in the scorecard, just not quite as big an F, which is why I come back to my grand hope that, in fact, the balance of power will be held by those that actually care about the environment more than certain businesses making money.
Thanks. Mark Shepherd.
This is kind of coming out of another wing. I remember when I was up around the Newcastle area, they were speaking about wave production and the power of waves. Yes. Now, it went nowhere. Is it still in any kind of shape or form, Leslie?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question also. Yes, waves produce an enormous amount of energy, and it would be wonderful to harness that. My understanding, which is quite shallow, of the reason why we don't have energy producing waves all over the place is that the pressure on the infrastructure is so great that it just doesn't last. So building something cheaply enough to compete with other forms of energy production to harness the energy from waves has turned out to be very, very difficult because the waves just wreck the infrastructure. And now that solar and wind are so cheap, you're also competing on that cost basis. So I think there's been a couple of kind of pilot projects, one in Korea and one somewhere that I can't remember, testing it out. And perhaps in the future there'll be clever ways of doing it that overcomes those practical engineering problems. But at the moment, it doesn't compete on cost. And you're on.
Yes, Cecily?
Oh, I just wanted to ask again, Leslie, back to the wind production. The land wind farms, they often get a lot of criticism about the noise and what they do and what they don't do. I mean, I don't know a lot about the land wind farms, but whenever I've been near one, I can't hear anything in particular. Is that also a bit of a furphy, or are they worthwhile on land?
There are people that are anti-renewables, or at least ideologically opposed to anything other than fossil fuels, that will use any argument that they can. There's been several major studies now done on looking at the human health impacts of living near a wind farm, and nobody's actually found anything. It's certainly the case that, people are suggestible. And if it is suggested to them that they are suffering and they're not being able to sleep and all of those sorts of things, they'll have a bad night and they'll go, oh, it's because of the wind turbines, But when you actually look at the data in a rigorous scientific way, there's little to no evidence that, in fact, wind farms are affecting people's health in any way. Now, it is the case that the occasional bird or flying fox will get chewed up, and certainly there's been moves, and I believe this happens, is that when, for example, there is a migration pathway, such as for the orange-bellied parrot at certain times of the year, they map that and they stop the turbines to ensure that that doesn't happen. So there are ways of adapting our energy production around keeping things as safe as possible. But look, when if you think about how many things are going to go extinct because of climate change, you do have to take a rather hard-nosed cost-benefit analysis to some of these forms of energy production. And sometimes, you'll crack a few eggs by making the omelette sort of thing. But for the most part, I don't think there's really any evidence much that wind farms are hurting anything.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments or surprises? Mari, did you have another one? You were just waving at me. Oh, Anne has another one. Yes, thanks, Anne.
I've read articles about the problems that are going to occur with the particularly solar panels, I think, but also I believe wind turbines when they wear out. Are we going to get rid of them? Are they going to create an enormous waste disposal problem? Are there plans, or are there people thinking about that at this stage?
Look, I think, yes, it's an issue because the early wind turbines and early solar panels are now coming to the end of their lives. But look, most of it's made of metal and concrete, and both of those things are recyclable. So yes, there are a lot of people thinking about how a circular economy can be imposed and encouraged and supported. And by circular economy, it means that one person's waste becomes another person's resource. And absolutely, we need strategies to deal with the waste issue and ensure that, it doesn't all end up going into landfill. There is a lot of research going into that. We just need the good policies to ensure that the best recycling actually happens.
Other questions? Margaret Jones.
Yes. I was just aware of the challenge for ecologists in terms of what you described that's happening in Tasmania, the flow-on effects of climate change and species having to move to another area and then causing problems for the species in that area that are then destroyed and the challenges for ecologists to try and combat some of that.
Yeah.
It's huge,
Look,
isn't it?
it's an issue of where science and human values clash. You know, we all think of native species as better than exotic species, but sometimes it's the native species going somewhere else within Australia that becomes the problem.
Yeah.
It's inevitable. Certainly in Tasmania, I believe that some of the fishermen now who've lost their lobster industry because of the kelp are now harvesting the urchins, you know, for Japanese roe. So, you know, some of these things are inevitable. That's what happens as the world changes.
Yeah.
And there's probably nothing much we can do about it. But I think it's a really interesting example of where human values, where we might value a koala more than a mosquito, for example, clash with some inevitable change that the climate is causing. And I think it's just a matter of actually facing up and acknowledging that we care about some things more than others. And that's what will create our policy. There's no right or wrong. You know, one species is you know, ostensibly the same as any other species, but humans have a natural propensity to care more about some than others. And I think we just need to acknowledge that honestly.
Thank you.
One of my friends actually said, we talk about species that are adapting to climate change by moving, and he coined the phrase, well, do we shoot it or give it a medal?
Yeah.
Do we shoot it for
Right.
causing problems,
Yes.
or do we give it a medal for being adaptable? And really, that's a values judgment.
Yes.
Margaret Hitchie, you had another one? You're on mute,
Yeah,
Margaret.
sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks. There are a number of organisations that are doing their darndest to, number one, wake us up, number one, and also give us the real story. And above the first of those for me is your Climate Council, which is absolutely amazing. And I was just wondering, where are you at the moment? What influence do you think can increase for your organisation? And knowing the way in which it all began and all the expertise that's there, as you have just, you know, exhibited to us today, could you give us a little bit of an idea of is there anything more we can do to push what you're doing in the Climate Council?
Thanks, Margaret. I'm really glad you appreciate the Climate Council, because it's something that I'm very, very proud of. So the Climate Council, as most of you will be aware, was launched after the Abbott government abolished the Climate Commission, on which I also sat. We will be 12 years old this September, so we've certainly outlasted the Abbott Prime Ministership, which always gets me good applause when I mention that in public setting. So we've gone from strength to strength. There's been a little bit of ups and downs in recent times, because with cost of living going up, donations for all charities have gone down. So we had to pull our heads in a little bit and lost a few people over that. But we're about 50 strong in terms of staffing. We've started a number of other organisations, such as the Climate Media Centre and the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action and the Cities Power Partnership, that we support. We have now, the number of councillors goes up and down. I think we're at about 8 or 9 at the moment. We fluctuate a little bit, but we have about 50 staff or so. So we now have a turnover of millions, but we have to, you know, very much live within our means. Our main focus at the moment, we're keeping up the drumbeat of reminding everybody that impacts like, you know, tropical cyclones hitting Brisbane probably wouldn't have happened without climate change. So we're keeping up all that physical impacts work. But at the moment, a lot of the focus is on the upcoming election. and providing, well, we provide information to anybody who wants it, but we're particularly providing good information to progressives that are, you know, pushing for increased climate action in those seats where they could really make a difference. So working with a lot of the Teals and other progressive independents. I mean, if there's a non-Teal that wants the information, it's there for them as well. Because, you know, we see a progressive independent balance of power will be the best thing for climate action. So we want, you know, we can't say, well, don't vote for this party, vote for that party. We're not allowed to do that, but we can actually have the goal of a climate action friendly parliament after this election. So that's a lot of the focus at the moment.
Thanks. Thank you.
Mari O'Shea.
You hear a lot of the general public saying, or media highlighting the increase in power energy prices. How do we kind of counteract that or give a response that's fits in with what we need to do climate change wise?
Well, look, the several organisations, including the Climate Council, have got good data on their websites about power prices and what's cheapest and what's not. There's been quite a lot of modelling coming back to the nuclear versus renewables debate, if I could call it that, about how much the nuclear, building nuclear power stations would cost compared to continuing the rollout of renewables. And all of that data is out there. So, you know, if you have got people saying things that you think is wrong, go and look for the data because it's all out there. It's very clear that solar and wind is now cheapest, and we've got to keep reminding people of that message.
So just to respond, I mean, is some of the costs now in getting the roll out, and as that's more rolled out, but some of those costs will decrease?
Sure. Yeah, so a lot of the cost of energy is in the initial phase when it's being built, and once it's up and running, it, you know, comes along. We're very much in the building phase at the moment, so renewables are costing a lot of money, but just as that, it costs a lot to keep getting coal-fired power stations up and running after they fail, and it'll cost even more to get nuclear energy up, which will produce a lot less energy, actually. There is no suggestion that nuclear power could actually replace renewables in terms of providing all of our energy, so why even start? So yes, the cost of living is hurting a lot of people. I suggest it's more to do with housing affordability and interest rates than energy bills. I just got my latest energy bill yesterday and had an $18 credit on it because of my solar panels. So, you know, but I am, of course, in a fortunate position of owning a house and having the money to pay for the upfront cost of panels. Not everybody is in that position, but pretty much everybody is in a position of choosing to pay for green power, even if they live in an apartment or a rented place. So if people really care about the climate, even if they're not in a position of owning a house and having the money to invest in that sort of infrastructure, everybody can choose green power. And I remember hearing the former head of AGL saying on an interview once, if everybody ticked the box for green power, we'd have to shut Liddell Power Station tomorrow because we couldn't sell that power. So it's something to encourage people to do.
Just following
and just on that, sorry, Anne, there is a fantastic, Greenpeace have put out a fantastic website called the Greenpeace Green Power Guide. It's really, really easy to use. You put in some details. It gives you the power companies in the order of how green they are. And if you want to change to one, you hit a single button and everything else is done for you. So I think it's just a really, really easy to use practical tool. And it'd be great to get the word out about that. And I used it fairly recently to change my power provider to a greener company.
That touches in with what I was going to say. So I will add what following on your comments about the Climate Council, when we put your talk up on our webpage in our introduction to it, we'll give the link with the Climate Council.
Right.
And now you've mentioned the Greenpeace Green Guide. We'll do the same thing with that. That's really helpful to people. So to answer Mario O'Shea's question, there'll be a link there that you'll be able to go back and ask the questions. It's one of the best websites I know, the Climate Council.
Great. Another really good website that you might want to also advertise is Market Forces. So Market Forces is an organisation that assesses how much fossil fuel investment banks and superannuation companies and insurance companies are indulging in. And you can go to the Market Forces website and find out, you know, what your exposure is to fossil fuel investment from your bank, etc. And they also make it very easy to switch. So that's another one that I always like to give a plug for, because people only do things if it's easy, but those organisations make it easy.
Other questions or comments?
Can I just ask one more thing to Leslie, please? In regard to the ocean and the ocean species, the soft plastic issue, which it seems to have been abandoned in Australia, or at least in New South Wales, and hard plastics for that matter. For a while, I was stockpiling my soft plastics. I could not bear to put it in the bin. But I don't know what to do about it, because
all right. Well, I've got another website for you.
Excellent.
Yes, so there's and some councils are paying for it and some aren't. My council, which is Ryde, is paying for it. There's a group called Recycle Smart. In my local government area, the council paid for a trial last year, which they're now continuing this year, where you can put out 2 bags of plastic bags about every 6 weeks. It's not quite enough, but you can recycle with them lots and lots of things, plastics, clothing, all sorts of weird and wonderful things like x-rays, batteries, all sorts of things. So if you go to the Recycle Smart website and find out if your local government is actually paying for a trial, in which case you just sign up and it won't cost you anything. Or if they're not, you do have to pay, but it's a fairly nominal amount if you're about this sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I put out 2 bags worth of I tried to collect as little plastic as possible by, not getting plastic bags from the supermarket, etc. But it's inevitable that you do. It's hard to buy food without any plastics. But every 6 weeks, I put out my 2 bags of plastics and they get collected and recycled. Yeah. That's another link and to put on your website, Recycle Smart. Cool. They also send regular emails about how to live more sustainably, which are quite good.
Thanks, Leslie.
Stancia, you had a question.
Oh, thanks so much, Leslie, and thanks for all. I get all the emails from the Climate Council, so I just applaud all the great work that you're doing. And just wondering, any updates because I know there has been connection, First Nations people and working with Climate Council, etc., and other bodies, in terms of science and like cultural burn, for instance, really sort of trying to help manage some of the forests a lot better than what they are being managed. I know from bushwalking for many years, there's a lot of forests that you walk through and you think this is a time bomb waiting to go off because of the understory and everything, as you know so well. So I was just wondering a little update on where that might be at the moment.
Yes, so the best thing to do is to have a look at the ELCA website, which is the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, which is, led by Greg Mullins, former New South Wales Fire Chief, and a whole bunch of other former emergency leaders. Greg, I know, is personally extremely interested in cultural burning and is, working quite closely with a lot of Indigenous people. I think I probably have a little bit of an unpopular view about some of that, because I think the notion of cultural burning as opposed to Western style hazard reduction management has been looked at a little bit uncritically. In my view, as a scientist, we need to do the science on both types of hazard reduction and assess it. The other thing, of course, is that even if that sort of cultural burning has been really successful for the last 65,000 years, the past climate is not actually a very good indicator of the future climate. And what we're facing now is a climate that none of our First Nations people in the past faced. So I think, yes, let's look at the cultural burning, which is a big overarching banner, and it's highly variable as well. By all means, look at that at the same time as the more Western style hazard reduction burning, but let's look at it both types critically and in the right context, and in the context of the climate that we're getting, not the climate that we've had. We also do have an Indigenous woman on our board, the Climate Council board, Natalie Walker. And I would love to see an Indigenous councillor. We don't have one at the moment, but I'm hoping that will happen.
Other questions or comments at this point? Oh, wow, I'm just thinking, what an afternoon, Leslie. Margaret,
there's another Helen.
Helen, sorry, Helen, I missed you. Thanks.
Just want to say I'm hopeful. If what I'm hearing from you is correct, do you believe 100% renewable is possible for Australia?
Yes, I do. But on the way, we certainly will still need to use a little bit of gas called peaking gas, but only a very small amount. So yes, I think it's technically possible. The difficult thing is moving from one completely different system in terms of transmission and all of that sort of thing to another completely different system. But engineering wise, there's nothing impossible about it. It's just that transition that's difficult. So I think we'll get there. On the way towards net zero, we'll still need to use a bit of peaking gas, just for those very few occasions when the weather isn't kind and we don't have enough storage. But it is a matter mostly of putting in enough storage. You do need a lot of storage. Most of the really big batteries will only store enough for a town for a couple of hours. So let's not underestimate how much storage we need, but we just need to get along and do it. The other thing is that, I often think that it won't be the scientists or the politicians that will save us from climate change. It will be the engineers. There's an awful lot of very clever and inventive people out there working really, really hard to make better systems and better gadgets and better technology to solve this problem. So we've just got to be mindful of that and create a system where those sorts of innovations get to market and get used as quickly as possible.
Thank you for giving us hope.
Yes.
I'll say something about hope, Anne.
Yes, I'd love you to, because I was just going to say what a lovely comment.
Because
yes,
people often ask, are you hopeful about the future? And after thinking about this for a long time, I'll say, well, I don't have any other choice really, but to be hopeful. Hope is a strategy, not an emotion anymore in this context, because what's the counterfactual? If we don't have hope, well, then we give up. And if we give up, all of us, those of us on the right side of history, well, then, we're really stuffed. So hope has got to be, an optimism for the future has got to be our driving force. I don't think we've got any other option, even though some days it's really hard, and we should acknowledge that as well.
Yeah. And that was something I was going to say. Some of us were privileged to be there for the 10-year celebration of the Climate Council. And one of the things that gave me hope was the number of young people who were really doing the study. They weren't just doing, they were the engineers, the young scientists and the engineers who really are dedicating much of their life to this.
because it's also for them facing an uncertain future. It's actually a way of coping with the future.
Yes.
Because one way of coping is to work towards a better world. You know, that's how we all cope, really. Because there's nothing worse than everybody saying, well, I'm just going to leave it to somebody else. You know, and I often put up that poster that says, we are the ones we've been waiting for, because we've all caused it. We all have a responsibility to help fix it. And just waiting for everybody else to do something is abdicating our responsibilities. But it is, for young people, that's one of the ways they're coping, is to say, well, I'm going to make a career out of solutions. And that's great.
And Leslie, in spite of all of the dire news you gave us, there is something in how you speak with that you always give us a sign of hope. And I really appreciated all your up-to-date. Every time I come, I feel like I know something more, I grow in our understanding. You continually to be so passionate about all of this after all of these years. And I think if anyone should give up hope, it's you, but you never do.
Oh, you know, I have my days. You know?
Don't we all?
I have my days when I just think somebody else can do stuff now, you know, but then you can't leave it. I mean, I often say being in the climate change space is like Hotel California, you know, you can never leave it once you're in it.
And I must say that we here at CCJP think that too, and think, oh, you know, 35 years later, why are we still doing this? Or
because you have
actually,
to.
Yeah, it's 40 years now. Oh, no, anyway, 35. So, but the other thing is that I'm so glad we're still your favourite Catholics, and and you will always be one of our favourite speakers. So, thank you very much for coming and joining us this afternoon.
Thanks very much for having me. Keep up your good work as well.
Thanks, Leslie, very much. And thank you
you
to all of you for joining today. So, you know, so good to see all your faces, new and renowned. Thank you.
Yeah. And Marilyn Cutler from Queensland, we hope you survive the next few days.
Yes, we're thinking about all our Queensland friends at the moment.
Yes, yeah, great.
Yeah.
So
all right,
well to you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Right,
bye. Thank you, Leslie.
Bye.